In this video, I'm going to look at how to set up, control, and edit motion sequences. To demo this feature, I'm going to start with a really basic patch. So let's go to Category Search and grab hold of an initialized AWM2 patch, which is just an extremely basic piano. Let's edit Part 1 and Element 1, and you can see that it's using the CF3 stretch sample. So let's click on that and category search to replace it with the stereo PWM strings sample. I'm going to use this because it has plenty of harmonics and it's a very simple sound that we can play with to demo motion sequences. So let's come back to Performance Home again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by programming the super knob to control the pitch of that patch so that you can both hear and see the motion sequence in action. So let's set that up now. We'll head back to Edit, Part 1 and Element 1. I'm going to grab hold of the coarse pitch, and of course Control Assign lights up. So I'm going to assign that to knob 1. And now the assignable knob will change the pitch, the coarse pitch of that element from between 0 to its highest level, which is plus 48 semitones. So let's check that again. Now that's assigned to the part level knob, but of course when we drop to the performance level, then that will have no effect. So we need to go back to Control and Control Assign for knob 1, and we'll map that to part 1, assign 1. And now at the performance level, we have the coarse tuning applied. Okay, so back to Performance Home. Now we need to attach the super knob to that, and we'll do that by going to Motion Control and Super Knob. We can see that it's currently linked to all of those knobs, so it will do what we want to do so far, but I'd only want it to affect that first knob, so let's turn off the link for the final 7 elements. And I don't need to set any positions because by default it's going to go from full off to full on. So now I should have control of that coarse pitch with the super knob. Okay, that's all fine. Now we need to go and attach the motion sequence. So I'm going to turn on the motion sequence master switch, which you can either do on the touchscreen or with the button on the panel. I'm going to turn on super knob motion sequence, and you will notice that as soon as I did that, the readout for knob 1 turned into this colored dial rather than the manual version. That just means that it's being controlled by a motion sequence rather than manually with your hands. And now let's go and edit the super knob motion sequence. It's at this point that I can tell you what a motion sequence actually is. As you can see from the pattern here, it's a low frequency oscillation and that you can program to do whatever you want. But in its most basic form, it is indistinguishable from LFO. So if we hear that now, you can see and hear the pitch rising on that triangular curve and then immediately falling back. So I'm going to show you how to program some basic LFO shapes, and then we'll come back and look at some more useful applications. So we're currently using sequence number 1 of 8. So let's switch over to sequence 2. If you have a Montage or a Montage M, you can use the button grid to do that. Otherwise, use the touchscreen. So we're now editing sequence 2, and let's go and edit that sequence. Right now we have the maximum 16 steps, and I'm going to reduce that down to 8. And the reason for that is that I want to be able to control each one of those steps all in one go with my hardware faders. Again, on MODX you have access to 4 at a time. I'm also going to change the amplitude to 127, which means that the motion sequence now has the ability to take the parameter from its lowest value to its highest value. At the moment, each one of these steps is set to 64, which means it'll go to half of the full potential value. Now, let's use the hardware faders to raise all of those up to full. And what we now have is essentially a sawtooth wave on the LFO. Wonderful. Let's do another one with another common LFO shape. Let's do a square wave. So once again, let's reduce down the number of steps, increase the amplitude, and now I'm going to change the curve type from standard to threshold. What threshold does is it stays at a certain level and then rises to another level and stays there. Now at the moment it's got a curve upwards, which is not what we want for a square wave. So I'm going to use parameter 1, I'm assuming that's what PRM1 means, parameter, and reduce it so that it starts rising immediately. And then I'm going to take parameter 2 and set that to 0 so that there's no rise, it just immediately steps up. That's now doing what we want. Let's raise the faders all to maximum. But this isn't really a square wave yet because it's not doing anything. So let's take the even numbered faders and reduce them. And now we have a square wave. Let's do one more curve type in sequence 4. We're going to try to approximate a sine wave where it rises and falls in a smooth pattern. So again, 8 steps, maximum amplitude. And this time I'm going to change the curve from standard to sigmoid, which has this familiar S-shaped curve, and then raise all the faders again to maximum. And what we now have is an approximation of half of a sine wave. But it's only half because it immediately steps down again once it reaches the maximum. So this is where curve 2 comes in. I'm going to change curve 2 to also be sigmoid and to be reversed. So as you can see in the first curve it will rise and start to level off, and in the second curve it will start at that high point, come down and level off at the low point. I now need to switch the even numbered curves to use that. And you can either do that on the touchscreen or using the Sine buttons. And now we should have a rough approximation of a sine wave. And you can see from the super knob that we have some degree of ease in and out for that curve. So those are some basic LFO patterns, but what about something that you might actually use? Well, let's go to sequence 5, and I'm going to program in something like a sequence. So let's take the amplitude up to full again and change to threshold once again, and we'll use the same parameters that we did before to make it step immediately. And now I can use the faders to program in a sequence. If I want to use the second batch, I just select those, and now my faders will control that bank too. And when I play that, I have a fairly horrible sounding sequence. But if you know that the value of the coarse pitch is going between 0 and 48 semitones, then you can use a spot of maths to work out the numbers that you would need to get the exact pitches that you want. Let's come out of there for a moment and talk about looping and triggering. Right now, as you can see, the sequence is running at all times. But I could change that to only trigger when I want it to trigger. So let's turn the motion sequence off and turn on trigger and turn off loop. Now, I have no sequence running at all until I press the trigger button. And then it will hold on the last step until I press trigger again. And I can pause the sequence at any point using the motion sequence hold button. The use of loop is obviously fairly obvious. I've also got the option to sync the motion sequence to the tempo, the beat or the arpeggio. I won't go into those because they should be fairly straightforward. So with our collection of entirely horrible motion sequences, Montage and Montage M users can switch between those sequences using the button grid, whereas if you're using a MODX, you'll need to head to the motion sequence menu here and use the touchscreen to switch between the various sequences. So now that we've seen motion sequences in action, let's go and do something that is genuinely useful. So I'm going to go back into motion control and turn off the SuperNob motion sequence. And this time I'm going to start by changing the fine pitch of the PWM element on this to give it a sort of an analog warble. So I'm going to click on fine pitch and control assign, and I'm going to assign this to motion sequence lane 1. Why are there multiple lanes? Well, we'll see in a moment. So here is motion sequence 1. Let's edit the sequence. We need to turn on the lane switch, and we're going to edit sequence 1. Notice that sequence 5 was selected. That's because the sequence number that is currently in use is global to the entire performance. So if you switch sequence 5 because you're using it on the SuperNob, then the individual part level sequences will also switch to to number 5. We'll come back to that in a minute. So let's go and program this. I'm going to edit this. I'm going to change the cycle to 8 because I don't need much more than that. Full amplitude, and this time I'm going to use a bipolar motion sequence, meaning that the values can go above and below the threshold point. So let's program in something like that. And now remember, this is affecting the fine pitch. You can hear that we've got a sort of a random warble to it. At the moment, there's no smoothing attached, but if I dial up the smoothing, although there's no visualization for this, it's just smoothing off the edges of all of those curves. Let's go and change pulse B to be something like a bounce and throw in a few of those. So now we've got this analog warble. Let's hear it without. And with. Okay. Now remember, this is sequence 1 on lane 1. Let's come back out of there and add another element. So I'll turn this on, and of course we've just got the piano sound now, but I want to go and find some noise. Let's have white noise. And I want to do something like a sort of Jean-Michel Jarre style noisy, wavy, windy effect. So let's do that using the cutoff. I'm just going to mute element 1 for now. So let's take the cutoff and reduce it to nothing. And then control assign that to motion sequence lane 2, because I don't want it to use the same motion sequence as the other part, the other element even. So we've now got motion sequence lane 2 controlling the cutoff. Let's edit that motion sequence, and you can see that now lane 2 is selected, and there's currently no curves enabled because the lane switch is off. So let's turn that on. It's currently set to not trigger, but you could set individual sequences to trigger by using, or rather individual lanes to trigger. Let's edit that sequence, and let's do the same thing as we've done before. Let's make it a unipolar, I think. And now I'm going to do something that has a slightly smoother look to it. Maybe we'll use FM. And let's hear that. Let's add a load of smoothing to that. Maybe we should add the rest of the sequence too, so that we can bring it back down from that level it rises to. Okay, let's come out of there, turn element 1 back on, and hear what we've got. Now, as I said, the currently active sequence is global, so if we needed to change the motion sequence that we were working on for sequence 1, for example, to sequence 2, and let's just use that for now, we also have the same happening for lane 2. It will also switch to sequence 2. So if we were happy with this sequence and we want it to also apply to sequence 2, we could just do Shift, Edit, and copy part 1, lane 2, sequence 1 to sequence 2. And now we have a copy of that sequence sitting in position 2. And then we can go and edit lane 1, sequence 2, and do whatever it is we want to do to that, which I think we were just using sort of analog wobbly stuff, weren't we? So let's do some of that. And smooth that right off. And so now we should be able to switch the motion sequence. So this is using sequence 2, and that's using sequence 1. Let's come back into the editor again and collect sequence 2, which of course is the wind noise, and make that trigger. So that's not going to happen until we do something with it. Probably. Let's turn off the loop for that. Hopefully this was a relatively useful demo of what motion sequences can do. There are many, many uses for this. Of course, you can use a motion sequence to attach to any parameter that is control assignable, including the super knob. So really there is no limit to what you can do with your super programmable LFOs, which is what motion sequences are. In the next video, we'll look at one of Montage and MODX's most impressive features, arpeggios.